technical institute or institution of higher learning. We are 48th in the nation in terms of the students who stay in school after the first year. In other words, we have standards that allow students to get into different post-secondary programs, but they aren't prepared well enough to make it beyond the first year. We almost lead the nation in the number who drop out before the second year. That is a tragic situation, and I think it's a direct reflection on a couple of other factors. One is that when Dennis and Mike took office, in terms of the overall budget of state government, 39% of that budget was devoted to K through 12 education, preparation for just what you're talking about. 39%. 8 years later, that percentage is 30%. Now we need to ask ourselves, where did that 9% go? What are they now investing in? And I again go back to the size of state government, which has gone from 12,900 employees to 14,460. We've added a new employee every 48 hours. Now, we can control that growth. I know we can do it, but it takes the intestinal fortitude to say that if we change priorities and we're going to expand in this area, we're going to contract in another area, particularly in a state where the population has remained relatively flat. Directly, yes, we should avail ourselves of those funds, and yes, the premise of the question is accurate, and that's where we ought to direct the dollars.
Well, again, if the question refers to the bill that was just passed by the House today, I think it is too early to say whether or not South Dakota should accept the education portion of those funds. The legislative language is very vague, and regulations are going to determine how those dollars are spent. If I were voting on that bill today, I would have voted no in Congress, because I think the federal government, in passing another bailout of the states, is simply reinforcing the irresponsible behavior of many other states who are relying upon, in fact, adopted a budget that relied upon such an extension before the extension was even adopted. California, New York, they're 5-6 weeks into their budget year. They haven't even adopted a budget for this year. They're so out of control, and this bailout simply reinforces that irresponsible behavior. South Dakota balanced its budget without raising taxes, without using reserves, and without depending upon this money. Now, Governor Rounds has stated that he believes we should accept the Medicaid share of that money. And I don't know, I haven't read the bill, if Senator Heiderbrum is familiar with the terms. It is true that the former bailout bill said if money is not accepted and spent in one state, it will be made available for expenditure in another state. If that is true about the Medicaid dollars, then certainly I agree we should accept them, because if our children and grandchildren are going to bear the debt, then I believe our state should bear the benefit, should receive the benefit as well. But I think the education funding, we need to look at what are the strings that the regulatory agency, the Department of Education, is going to place upon them. If it forces us to hire teachers where they would not otherwise be hired, create expectations of further expenditure in future years, when that money goes away, the spending better go away. Because if we don't have it to spend, we're not like the states where they spend it anyway.
I get a rebuttal. I think it's amazing to hear the Lieutenant Governor talk like a fiscal conservative. If you think we've been governed by fiscal conservatives over the last 8 years, you're sorely mistaken. 7 of those 8 years we've had deficit budgets. That means we've had structural deficits. We have taken in less money than we have spent in 7 of those 8 years. It's interesting to hear him talk about how wildly out of control states like California are. Pick up the June 24 issue of Time magazine, just a month and a half ago. Time magazine did their cover story was called The Broken States of America. And it did a comparison. It took 2 statistics, very simple ones. What is your state's budget deficit? And what is your state's revenue stream? Our budget deficit is $107 million. Our revenue stream is $1.14 billion. In other words, our deficit is almost 10%. It's actually 9% of our revenue stream. In other words, we're going to need 9% of next year's revenue stream just to pay the deficit. That's the kind of management we've had in Pierre for the last few years. But let's go go to the comparison with California. The Lieutenant Governor is critical of California for out-of-control spending. If you look at that article from Time Magazine, it's fascinating. Because in comparing California's deficit to their revenue stream, they rate 9.1%. South Dakota is 9.0%. If you like management California style, we've got something pretty close to that going on in South Dakota. What we need to do is restrain spending at every opportunity, and we can do that by shrinking the size of government. That option was on the table, but it was rejected by the group that sat around the table in the governor's office the night before the final day of the session.
All right. This question goes to Dennis. Does anybody from the audience want to ask a question? Dr. Clausenbusch.
Hi guys. I'm Kevin Clausenbusch. I'm a practitioner in Huron, right down the road from Miller. My question to you is, if you look at our state's budget deficit, what do you guys think about a state income tax?
Thanks for the question. I would be opposed to a state income tax. I believe that even when it's proposed, the citizens have rejected it time and again. And further, in my belief, I think if it's proposed as a way of reducing other taxes, it may do so in the beginning. But in the end, I think we simply have overall more taxes as other taxes rose to their previous levels. So I would be opposed to an income tax. I think our state budget, again, does have some challenges, but they're not the challenges born of an irresponsible spending spree, as has been portrayed. The challenges arise out of two things, and they're common to all the states that have budget deficits. Decline in revenue as a consequence of the national recession, and an increase in Medicaid costs as a consequence of the national recession. South Dakota's budget is in much better shape than other places. And again, to use Time Magazine as your source for fiscal analysis, they're struggling to even keep afloat, those news magazines. To suggest that they can do an accurate analysis of all the states, I wouldn't rely on that, and neither should you.
It's interesting. I just saw Time Magazine was ranked as the most trustworthy magazine in the world. So I guess that's something that I would rely on, and the Lieutenant Governor would not. Interesting to see what he would rely on, and maybe we can discuss those sources. I'm ready to have that conversation too. I also would oppose a state income tax. Any discussions of new taxes should not take place at all until and unless you can get the fiscal house in order. Otherwise, it just becomes a band-aid for the problem that persists. Now, again, I think I can make sense of this, and I've made this explanation for the Lieutenant Governor before. Government grows not because people are evil or lazy or leaning on their shovels. Government grows because people are good, and they want to do a better job. They're hired to do something, and they think to themselves, I could do a better job in the department of XYZ if I just had an assistant or a part-time someone. And after a few years, that works its way through the appropriations process. It gets approved, and government grows. The problem is, unless you discipline yourself to make certain that it contracts elsewhere, it's just going to go like that. And that's what's happened in South Dakota. To go from 12,900 to 14,460 jobs in a state whose population has remained relatively static. None of your businesses could do that. You just couldn't do that. We have to match and get in sync the money we bring in and the money we spend. We don't have any choice about it anymore. $107 million deficit, that's really inexcusable and it can't be sustained.
Well, again, I think I have a rebuttal here. I think it's important to understand, again, the premise of the argument that Senator Heidelberg is making, that government is growing. Those numbers that he references are a little bit exaggerated, but I won't delve into that. We did cut 100 FTEs last budget session, so if he thinks that it's not contracting ever anywhere, hasn't, we should go check his numbers again. I think we also need to recognize, where are those people? Where are those FTE numbers?